When a police officer orders his canine to attack a young black woman during an early morning jog, he has no idea she's the daughter of one of the department's most respected captains. What starts as a routine encounter spirals into a battle for accountability, forcing both father and daughter to confront the ugly truths about prejudice and the system they thought they could trust. But justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about the weight of what cannot be undone. Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now let's dive in. The morning air was crisp, and the soft light of dawn began to spread across the park's landscape. Maya laced up her running shoes with care, knowing today's run needed to be different. She had an important track meet in a few weeks, and the thought of standing on the starting line was both thrilling and nerve-wracking. Running had always been her way of feeling free, a space where she wasn't a student, a daughter, or anything more complicated than a person in motion. But there was more on her mind than racing. Lately, she had been trying to push harder, to feel stronger, to outpace some invisible weight she didn't yet have words for. Maya's mother had warned her about going for early morning runs by herself. It's quiet at that time. Not everyone out there has good intentions, she had said, her voice laced with concern. But Maya shrugged it off. This was her routine. She felt confident in the park's open spaces, the familiar paths, the wide expanse of trees that surrounded her favorite trail. These mornings felt sacred, hers alone. She adjusted her headphones, checked her playlist, and set off at a comfortable pace. The rhythm of her shoes hitting the pavement was soothing, and the sound of her breath, steady and deep, settled her nerves. She let herself get lost in the run, the landscape blurring as she picked up speed. The scent of damp grass filled the air, and the golden hue of the rising sun cast a warm glow over the park. As she rounded a bend near the lake, Maya noticed something out of the corner of her eye. A police car parked on the side of the path, an officer leaning against the vehicle, his canine dog sitting obediently beside him. She thought little of it at first. Police presence in public parks wasn't unusual. But as she continued down the trail, she noticed the officer's gaze following her, sharp and unrelenting. Her heartbeat, which had been elevated from the run, now pounded harder for a different reason. She slowed her pace slightly, debating whether she should loop back or keep going. A strange unease crept up her spine, but she told herself not to overthink it. She had done nothing wrong. This was just a morning jog. But as she passed the squad car, the officer took a step forward, his hand resting on the dog's leash. "Hey!" he called out. His voice was sharp, not friendly. Maya's stomach twisted. She pulled her headphones out and turned toward him. "Yes?" she asked, forcing calm into her voice. The officer, whose name tag read Ryan, gave her a hard, assessing look. His expression was flat, as though trying to mask suspicion that was already rooted deep within him. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, taking a few steps closer. His hand hovered near the radio, clipped to his uniform, fingers twitching as if he was already anticipating a problem. Maya frowned, confusion spreading across her face. "I'm just running," she said, gesturing to the path. "It's a public park." Ryan's eyes narrowed as if her answer wasn't enough. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area," he said. "You fit the description." A cold knot tightened in Maya's chest. She had heard those words before, in stories shared by friends and family. You fit the description. It was a phrase heavy with implications, one that didn't need to be explained. It meant she was being judged not for what she had done, but for who she was, or rather, how she looked. Maya tried to steady her breathing, knowing that anger or fear would only make things worse. "I don't know anything about that," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I'm just out for a run." But the officer didn't back down. "Stop right there," he ordered. "Hands where I can see them." She took a step backward, instinctively raising her hands. Her pulse drummed in her ears, and she could feel the prickling heat of humiliation spreading through her chest. It was early, too early for other joggers or witnesses. She was alone in the middle of the park, with no one but this officer and his dog. Ryan tilted his head toward the dog at his side, which was now alert, ears perked. "We'll see about that," he muttered, almost to himself. Maya's heart sank as he reached for the dog's leash. "Look," I haven't done anything wrong, she said quickly, her voice edged with panic. I'm just here to run. Ryan gave a short, dismissive laugh, as if her words meant nothing. The tension thickened between them, a silent standoff hanging in the air. And then, before she could say anything more, Ryan gave a sharp command. Get her. The canine sprang forward, barking fiercely as it lunged toward Maya. She had no time to react. One moment she was standing on the path, the next she was on the ground, the weight of the dog pressing down on her legs. She cried out, instinctively shielding her face with her arms as the dog snapped its jaws, grazing her calf. Pain shot through her leg and a tear welled in her eye, not just from the sting of the bite, but from the overwhelming sense of disbelief and fear. Please, stop, she shouted, her voice cracking. I didn't do anything. But the officer didn't move to call off the dog right away. He stood there, watching, his face unreadable. It was as if he had already decided she was guilty, even though there was nothing she could possibly have done to warrant this treatment. The dog's bark echoed loudly in the still morning air, and Maya's mind raced, her thoughts tumbling over each other. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding, it was something deeper, something uglier. In that moment, she wasn't an athlete or a student. She wasn't a daughter or a young woman with dreams. To this officer, she was nothing more than a threat. Finally, Ryan whistled sharply, and the dog backed off, though it remained tense, still ready to strike at the slightest command. Maya lay on the ground, her chest heaving as she fought to catch her breath. She could feel tears burning the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Ryan crouched down beside her, his expression cold and indifferent. Should have listened the first time, he muttered. Next time, don't act suspicious. Maya wanted to scream, to demand an explanation, but she knew it would do no good. Her voice would only fall on deaf ears. Instead, she swallowed her anger and humiliation, biting down on her lip until she tasted copper. Without another word, Ryan stood up, gave the leash a tug, and walked away with the dog at his side, leaving Maya lying on the pavement, stunned and shaken. She sat up slowly, clutching her leg where the dog's teeth had grazed her skin. A dull ache settled in her bones, but the pain in her chest, the pain of being reduced to nothing more than a stereotype, cut deeper than any bite could. As she tried to compose herself, a realization settled over her like a heavy cloud. This wasn't over. It wouldn't end here, on this trail, with her lying alone on the cold ground. Because what Officer Ryan didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine, was that the young woman he had just humiliated wasn't just anyone. She was Maya, the daughter of Captain James, one of the most respected officers in the department. And sooner or later, the truth would come to light. The fluorescent lights of the hospital room buzzed softly above Maya's bed, casting a pale glow over the sterile walls. Maya lay still, her leg bandaged where the canine's teeth had grazed her skin. The antiseptic smell mixed with the metallic scent of blood still lingering faintly in the air. She stared at the ceiling, her mind replaying the encounter over and over, as if searching for a way she could have avoided it. But no matter how she tried to rearrange the events, the outcome was the same. She had done nothing wrong, nothing, except exist in a world where people like her were often seen as guilty without evidence. A nurse came by to check her vitals, offering a polite but distant smile. "You're doing fine," the nurse said gently, patting Maya's arm. "Just a little shaken up, I'm sure." Shaken up was an understatement. The fear that had gripped her in the park still clung to her chest like a tight knot, refusing to loosen. Every bark of the officer's dog echoed in her mind, every sharp command replaying as if it were happening again. The door to the hospital room swung open suddenly, and Maya's father, Captain James, strode in with a mixture of panic and anger etched into his face. The moment his eyes landed on Maya, slumped against the hospital bed, his heart broke. "Maya," he called out, rushing to her side. His badge, still clipped to his belt, glinted under the harsh hospital lights, a reminder of the job he had always believed in, until now. Maya sat up slowly, her eyes red from unshed tears. "Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. James knelt beside her, his large hands carefully taking hers, as though she might break under the weight of his touch. "I'm here, sweetheart," he murmured. "What happened? Are you okay?" Maya gave a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Not really. James's jaw tightened as his gaze shifted to the bandage on her leg. He could feel the familiar storm of anger building in his chest, a tight, suffocating rage that he rarely allowed himself to feel. But today it burned with an intensity that frightened even him. "What did they do to you?" he demanded, his voice low but filled with fury. Maya swallowed hard. "It was a cop," she began, her words slow and deliberate. "He thought I don't know. He said I fit some description. He told his dog to." She trailed off, as if saying it aloud made the memory even sharper, even more unbearable. James's face went pale. He had seen things, more things than he ever wanted to admit, but nothing had prepared him for this. "A police officer did this?" he repeated, as though saying it again might change the truth. "Yes." Maya's eyes brimmed with unshed tears, but she blinked them back. "And he didn't even care. I told him I didn't do anything, but he didn't listen. He just saw what he wanted to see." James clenched his fist so tightly that his knuckles turned white. For years, he had defended the badge, insisting that the force was meant to protect and serve. But today, that badge had betrayed him in the worst way possible. It had hurt his daughter, his only child. "Did you get his name?" James asked, his voice a strained whisper. Maya nodded. "Ryan, Officer Ryan. He didn't even tell me why I was being stopped, just said I looked suspicious." James stood abruptly, pacing the small room as rage boiled inside him. He had worked his way up the ranks with pride, believing that justice and fairness were the pillars of his profession. But now, that belief felt hollow. "I'll handle this," James muttered, more to himself than to Maya. "This can't stand." Maya watched her father with a mixture of sadness and resignation. She knew he meant well, that he wanted to make things right. But deep down, she also knew that this wasn't just about one officer or one encounter. It was about a system built on assumptions, a world where people like her were guilty until proven innocent. "Dad, please," she said softly. "Don't make it worse." James stopped pacing and looked at her, his eyes filled with a fierce protectiveness. "Worse?" he repeated. "He ordered his dog to attack you, Maya. I won't let him get away with it." Maya sighed, leaning back against the pillows. "It's not just about him, Dad. It's everything. The way they looked at me, the way he spoke to me, it was like I wasn't even a person, just a threat." James's heart ached at her words. He had always tried to shield her from the ugliness of the world, but now it had found her, despite all his efforts. And the worst part was, it came from the very institution he had spent his life defending. "I'm going to the station," James said firmly. "I'll get to the bottom of this." Maya gave him a weary smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Good luck," she whispered. "You're going to need it." James left the hospital room with a heavy heart, his mind already racing with plans. He knew confronting the department wouldn't be easy. Ryan was just one officer among many, and the system had a way of protecting its own. But this was different. This was personal. Back at the station, James stormed into the precinct, his badge flashing as he moved through the halls with purpose. His fellow officers gave him questioning glances, sensing the storm brewing in his wake. "Where's Officer Ryan?" James demanded as he approached the desk sergeant. His voice was sharp, leaving no room for excuses. The sergeant looked up, startled. "He's on patrol," she said cautiously. "Why?" James's expression darkened. "Bring him in, now." The sergeant hesitated for a moment, but knew better than to argue with Captain James when he was in this mood. She picked up the radio and relayed the order. James's phone buzzed in his pocket, and he saw a message from his wife. "Any news?" "How's Maya?" he texted back quickly. "She's shaken but okay. I'll handle the rest." As he waited for Ryan's return, James couldn't help but feel the crushing weight of betrayal. This wasn't just about an officer's mistake. It was about the cracks in a system he had sworn to uphold. And now, those cracks had torn through his own family. Later that evening, Maya sat by her hospital window, watching the sun set over the park where everything had gone wrong. Her leg throbbed, but it was the ache in her heart that hurt the most. She thought about the officer, Ryan, and the look in his eyes when he told his dog to attack. There had been no hesitation, no doubt, just a certainty that she didn't belong. And now, as the sky darkened and the streetlights flickered on, Maya knew one thing for sure. She would never see the world the same way again. Neither would her father. Captain James sat at his desk, hands clasped together, staring at the incident report in front of him. It was thin, too thin. The document was filled with vague phrases like suspected individual and reasonable action taken in line with policy. There was no mention of Maya's fear, no acknowledgement of her innocence, and certainly no remorse. James felt the weight of the report like a stone in his chest, pressing against the rage simmering just below the surface. He pushed back from the desk, rubbing his hands over his face. The events of the past day had shattered something inside him. For decades, he had prided himself on being part of the system, believing that with enough good intentions and dedication, the system would deliver justice. But now, that faith felt fragile, barely holding together. The door to his office creaked open, and Officer Ryan stepped in, hands stuffed in his pockets, looking unconcerned. He wore the same calm, unbothered expression that James had seen on countless officers when complaints came across his desk, an expression that said, "This will blow over. It always does." James studied Ryan for a moment, his jaw tight. He wanted to unload all the fury bottled inside him, to tell Ryan exactly who he had hurt. But James was a captain. He knew how to hold himself back. If he let his emotions get the best of him, nothing would change. "Sit down," James said, keeping his voice controlled. Ryan sat, casually crossing one leg over the other. He gave a small shrug, clearly not grasping the severity of the situation. "So, what's this about, sir?" James leaned forward, his gaze locked on Ryan's. "Tell me what happened at the park." Ryan's expression didn't shift. "Routine call. The jogger matched the description of a suspicious person we were looking for. I acted accordingly." James's fists clenched under the desk. "A jogger," Ryan said, as if Maya were just some anonymous stranger. "You ordered the dog to engage," James stated flatly. Ryan shrugged again, as if the decision were no more consequential than choosing coffee over tea. "She didn't stop right away. It was a safety issue." "She didn't stop," James echoed slowly, the weight of Ryan's words sinking into him. "You thought a young woman running in a park was a threat." "Like I said," Ryan replied, his tone defensive now, "she matched the description." James's voice hardened. "The only thing she matched was a bias you carry around with you." Ryan blinked, clearly not expecting the direct accusation. But before he could respond, James continued, his voice rising slightly. "That jogger, the one you treated like a criminal, is my daughter, Maya James." The color drained from Ryan's face as the words hit him. For the first time, his casual demeanor cracked. I didn't know," he stammered, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. James leaned in, the controlled fury in his voice sharp as a blade. "And that's exactly the problem, Officer Ryan. That you didn't care who she was. You saw her, made a judgment, and acted. No questions asked. No second thoughts." Ryan opened his mouth to respond, but James cut him off. "This isn't going away, Ryan. There's going to be an investigation, and you will answer for every decision you made." Ryan's face tightened. "I followed protocol, Captain. I was doing my job." James stared at him, the cold fury in his eyes making Ryan squirm. "Your job," he repeated softly, "is to serve and protect, not to let your assumptions and fear turn innocent people into suspects." Ryan shifted uneasily in his seat but said nothing more. He seemed to sense that any further defense would only dig him deeper into the hole he had already created. The following day, James met with the department's Internal Affairs Division. The room was sterile and cold, filled with people James had worked with for years. But today, those familiar faces looked different, more distant, more cautious. They knew this case was delicate. It wasn't just about Officer Ryan or Maya, it was about the integrity of the department itself. "We'll conduct a full review," Chief Daniels said, his tone carefully measured. "But you know how these things go, James. We have procedures in place." James nodded, though his jaw was clenched tight. He knew exactly how these things went. Officers were protected by layers of bureaucracy, and complaints often disappeared into the system, buried under paperwork and excuses. "I want transparency," James said firmly. "Every step of the way. No shortcuts, no cover-ups." Daniels gave a small nod, but there was an uneasiness in his eyes. "Of course. But you also know there's a process for these investigations." James fought back the frustration bubbling inside him. Process. That word had never felt so empty. As he left the meeting, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from Maya. "How did it go?" James stared at the screen for a moment before replying. "It's a start. But it's not over yet." Meanwhile, Maya sat at home, her leg propped up on the couch. The physical pain from the dog's bite was manageable, but the emotional weight felt unbearable. She had spent the morning scrolling through social media, reading stories from people who had experienced similar encounters with law enforcement. Some had ended with apologies, others with lawsuits, but many, far too many, had ended in silence. No justice, no accountability. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. It was her best friend, Tiana, holding a small bag of snacks and wearing a sympathetic smile. "Hey," Tiana said softly, sitting beside Maya on the couch. "How are you holding up?" Maya gave a tired shrug. "I don't know. I keep thinking about what would have happened if I wasn't me, if I wasn't your friend or Dad's daughter, if I was just some girl running in the park." Tiana frowned. "You shouldn't have to think like that, though. It's not fair." Maya let out a bitter laugh. "Fair? None of this is fair. And the worst part is, I knew something like this could happen. I've heard the stories. I never thought it would happen to me." Tiana squeezed Maya's hand. "I'm so sorry, Maya, but you know what? Your dad's on it. If anyone can make this right, it's him." Maya nodded, though the weight in her chest didn't lift. She knew her father would fight for her, but deep down, she also knew that this wasn't just about one officer or one encounter. It was about a system that saw her as a threat the moment she stepped out of the house. That night, James sat at the dining room table, lost in thought. The investigation was only beginning, and he knew there would be resistance. Some of his colleagues would see him as a traitor for pushing back against one of their own. But James didn't care. He wasn't doing this as a captain. He was doing it as a father. Maya appeared in the doorway, her expression hesitant. "Hey, Dad." James looked up, offering her a tired but genuine smile. "Hey, sweetheart, how are you feeling?" Maya shrugged. "Better, I guess. Still processing everything." James nodded, understanding exactly how she felt. "We're gonna get through this," he promised. "I won't let them sweep this under the rug." Maya gave him a small, grateful smile. "I know, and thank you." James reached across the table and took her hand. "Always, Maya, always." As they sat in the quiet of their home, father and daughter side by side, they both knew the road ahead would be difficult, but they also knew they weren't alone. They had each other. And that, for now, was enough to keep moving forward. The day of the hearing arrived quickly, bringing with it a whirlwind of tension and unease. The conference room in the police headquarters was packed. Officers, internal investigators, legal representatives, and a few reporters sat shoulder to shoulder, waiting for the proceedings to begin. The department tried to keep the case under wraps, but the story had gained traction. News outlets framed it as more than just a disciplinary matter. It was a reflection of the growing scrutiny over law enforcement practices and the biases ingrained within the system. Maya sat at the front of the room beside her father, her heart thumping with a mixture of anxiety and resolve. Dressed simply but confidently, she looked straight ahead, determined to show no weakness. Her legs still throbbed under the weight of the bandages, but she ignored the discomfort, knowing today was about more than her injury. It was about reclaiming her voice. Captain James sat beside her, his jaw set in a grim line. His badge and uniform, symbols of a system he had once believed in without question, felt heavier than usual. Today, however, his role was clear. He wasn't here as an officer. He was here as a father seeking accountability for the harm inflicted upon his daughter. At the far side of the room, Officer Ryan sat with his legal counsel. His expression was muted, carefully neutral, though there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. He wore the appearance of a man who still thought things might blow over, that this was just another routine hearing he would get through without consequence. But James knew better. Chief Daniels called the room to order, his voice steady and deliberate. "This hearing will investigate the incident involving Officer Ryan and the use of force against Maya James," he announced, scanning the room with an air of professionalism that belied the weight of the matter at hand. "We are here to determine whether Officer Ryan's actions were in accordance with policy and, more importantly, whether those actions reflect the values of this department." Ryan's legal representative rose to deliver an opening statement outlining the officer's version of events. Officer Ryan responded to a call about a suspicious individual in the park. His actions were guided by training and protocol. Given the circumstances, he made a reasonable decision based on the information available at the time. Maya bit her tongue, fighting the urge to scoff aloud. Reasonable? She had been treated like a criminal, attacked, humiliated, and dismissed, all because of assumptions Ryan had made in a matter of seconds. James squeezed her hand under the table, a silent reminder to stay composed. They would have their turn to speak, and when they did, the truth would be heard. The panel turned to Ryan. "Officer Ryan," one of the investigators said, "can you explain the reasoning behind your actions that day?" Ryan straightened in his seat, clasping his hands together. The suspect matched the description we were given, a young woman in athletic gear. When I asked her to stop, she hesitated, which raised my concern. For officer safety, I made the decision to engage my canine partner. Maya clenched her fists under the table. His account was so clinical, so detached, as if the events were nothing more than a checklist of procedures. There was no acknowledgement of her fear, no admission that he might have been wrong. The panel nodded, jotting down notes. Then it was James's turn. He stood slowly, the weight of the moment pressing down on his shoulders. But when he spoke, his voice was steady, each word measured and deliberate. Officer Ryan claims he followed procedure, but what he fails to understand is that the problem isn't just what he did, it's why he did it, James began, his gaze sweeping across the room. When he looked at my daughter, he didn't see a young woman out for a run. He saw a threat, and he acted on that assumption without question. Ryan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but James pressed on. Maya is a student, an athlete, and, most importantly, a person. But none of that mattered in that moment. To Officer Ryan, she was just a silhouette that fit a description, a faceless figure who could be treated with suspicion and hostility. James's voice hardened, carrying the weight of both his anger and heartbreak. "I've served this department for over 20 years. I've defended this badge, stood by this institution, and believed in its mission. But I also know that if we don't confront our biases, if we allow assumptions to shape our actions, then we fail in that mission. We fail the very people we swore to protect." The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the scratch of pens on paper. Maya glanced at her father, gratitude welling up in her chest. He wasn't just fighting for her. He was fighting for something bigger, something that went beyond the walls of this room. The panel turned to Maya next. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "When Officer Ryan stopped me, I was confused. I didn't understand why I was being singled out," she began, her voice calm but resolute. "But then I realized it didn't matter who I was or what I was doing. It only mattered what I looked like." She looked directly at Ryan, her gaze unwavering. "I was afraid, not just because of the dog, but because I knew that in his eyes, I didn't matter. I wasn't a person. I was just a problem to be handled." Her words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. The weight of her testimony settled over the room, forcing everyone to confront the uncomfortable truth. This wasn't just about one officer's actions. It was about a system that allowed those actions to happen in the first place. After a long pause, the panel reconvened to discuss their findings. The deliberation felt like it stretched for hours, though in reality, it was only minutes. Finally, Chief Daniels addressed the room. "This department recognizes the gravity of what occurred," he said, his voice solemn. "We have determined that Officer Ryan's actions, while technically within policy, were influenced by implicit bias. As a result, he will be placed on administrative leave pending further review. Additionally, the department will implement mandatory training focused on bias awareness and the responsible use of force." Maya felt a strange mixture of emotions, relief, frustration, and a lingering sadness that no ruling could fully erase. Ryan had been held accountable, but the damage had already been done. And though the department's promises of reform were a step in the right direction, they felt like small gestures in the face of a much larger problem. As the hearing adjourned, James turned to Maya, his expression softening. "It's not perfect," he admitted quietly, "but it's something." Maya nodded, though her heart still felt heavy. "I know, Dad, and I'm proud of you, for standing up, for not letting them sweep it under the rug." James smiled, pulling her into a brief but fierce hug. "I'll always stand up for you," he whispered. As they gathered their things and prepared to leave, Maya glanced at Ryan one last time. His expression was unreadable, but she hoped, perhaps foolishly, that he would reflect on what had happened, that he would carry the weight of this day with him, just as she would carry the scar on her leg. Outside the building, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the city. Maya and James stood side by side, the cool breeze stirring the leaves at their feet. "It's not the end," Maya said softly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "But it's a start." James nodded, slipping his arm around her shoulders. "And we'll keep going," he murmured. "Together." They stood there for a moment longer, father and daughter, united by love and strengthened by the challenges they had faced. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they were ready to face it, together. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm, amber glow over the park where it had all begun. The breeze was gentle, rustling the golden leaves scattered along the paths. Maya sat on a bench beside her father, her leg resting on the grass, now healed enough that only a faint scar remained. It was a peaceful evening, but the calm didn't erase the weight they both carried. For the first time since the hearing, Maya felt like she could breathe a little easier. The emotional storm of the past few weeks was slowly subsiding, though the lessons it left behind lingered like footprints in wet cement, permanent, unshakable. "You okay?" James asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Maya turned to him and gave a small smile. "Yeah," she said, though the word was layered with a complexity she couldn't quite express. James nodded knowingly, as if he could feel the depth of everything she left unsaid. "I think about it too," he admitted, his eyes focused on the winding trail ahead of them. Maya leaned back against the bench. "It's strange, isn't it?" she murmured. "Being back here, after everything." James exhaled deeply. "Yeah," he said, "it is." They sat in silence for a moment, both lost in their thoughts. The park looked exactly the same as it had on the morning of the incident. Serene, ordinary. And yet, nothing about it felt the same to Maya. The shadows cast by the trees seemed sharper. The sound of dogs barking in the distance made her tense, even though she told herself not to. James glanced at his daughter, sensing the lingering unease in her posture. "We don't have to stay if it's too hard," he offered gently. Maya shook her head. "No, I want to," she said firmly. "I need to." She looked down at the faint scar on her leg and traced it lightly with her fingertips. It would fade over time, but the memory behind it would remain. Still, she was determined not to let that memory define her. She wouldn't let it shrink her world. "This park was mine before that morning," Maya whispered, more to herself than to her father. "And it still is." James smiled, a small, proud smile that didn't need words. His daughter had always been strong, but the past few weeks had revealed a new kind of resilience in her. It was a quiet strength, the kind that came from weathering storms and learning to stand taller afterward. The weeks following the hearing had been difficult, but illuminating. The department had made good on its promises. Bias awareness training had begun, and the officers were forced to confront uncomfortable truths about how they approached their jobs. The changes weren't immediate or perfect, but they were real. As for Officer Ryan, he remained on administrative leave. Whether or not his career would recover wasn't something Maya or James could control. What mattered was that he had been held accountable, maybe not in the way Maya had initially imagined, but in a way that planted seeds for future change. "I keep thinking about something," Maya said suddenly, breaking the stillness. James turned toward her. "What's that?" Maya hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "It's weird, but I don't hate him. Officer Ryan, I mean." She looked down, twisting a leaf between her fingers. "I thought I would, but I don't. I feel sorry for him." James raised an eyebrow, surprised by her words. "Sorry for him?" Maya nodded slowly. "Yeah, I mean, what kind of person looks at someone and only sees a threat? That's sad, you know?" She paused, trying to make sense of the emotions swirling inside her. "I think the real punishment for him is knowing what he did. Living with that. I don't think it's something you can walk away from." James studied his daughter, pride swelling in his chest. She had every reason to hold on to anger, to let the experience harden her heart, but instead she had chosen something far more powerful, empathy. "You're right," he said softly. "It's a kind of karma, isn't it? Carrying the weight of what you've done." Maya nodded, though the word karma felt more like a beginning than an end. It wasn't about revenge or even justice. It was about change. And change, she realized, wasn't just something that happened to other people. It was something she could be a part of. In the days following the hearing, Maya had found herself reflecting on the lessons she had learned, not just about the world, but about herself. She had seen firsthand how fragile safety could be, how quickly trust could be broken. But she had also discovered her own resilience, her ability to confront fear and reclaim her voice. James, too, had undergone a transformation. The badge he wore still carried meaning, but it no longer blinded him to the flaws in the system. He had seen how easy it was for good intentions to be overshadowed by bias, and he knew that change wouldn't come from silence. It would come from speaking up, from challenging the status quo, even when it was uncomfortable. "Do you think things will really change?" Maya asked, her voice quiet but hopeful. James tilted his head, considering her question. "I think change is slow," he admitted. "It's frustrating and it's messy. But every step counts. Every conversation, every moment like the one we had at the hearing, it all matters." Maya gave a small smile. "So we just keep going?" James smiled back. "Yeah,